Right. Well, I think you're going to have a lot of listeners out there who will find this story particularly interesting because it involves the development or creation of blues, country, and rock and roll music.
Interesting.
And it begins in the most unlikely of places with the illegal annexation of Hawaii.
We talked about that just a little bit in the first episode that you did.
Again, like all these histories are intermingled, right? They mesh in some really fun ways, and you find them influencing the same parts of history, but in different ways.
Yeah.
It's fun to see. I think that there's a fairly good commonality of understanding within the membership of the Church of Hawaii and its significance to Latter-day Saints. I believe it was, yes, the Hawaiian temple was the first temple built outside of the continental U.S.
Yeah, that seems right. Yeah.
So, and it's always had a pretty large, significant membership base of Latter-day Saints. Of course, we've got some really fun things about Hawaii. You have the Polynesian Cultural Center. And that is a blessing to the world, right? Because it's basically preserving the culture, traditions, and stories of many of the Polynesian communities, including those from Hawaii, Tonga, Samoa, even Easter Island is represented there. And it's just an amazing contribution to humanity to have those cultures preserved.
Yeah.
That said, Hawaii has an interesting history that resulted in Latter-day Saints being represented there. And it started in the early 19th century. There was, of course, the early explorers of the oceans ended up on Hawaii at some point. And they introduced Christianity for the first time. This transformed the Hawaiian Islands. At a time when it was finally, for the first time, becoming united. And it's very interesting that those happened around the same time. It was King Kamehameha, who was the first chief to finally unite the different tribes of Hawaii. And soon after, Christianity was introduced among them. Now, this stopped a lot of practices among the Hawaiians. Notably, it ended the tradition of the hula for about a generation. And this was because Christians thought it too provocative and unbecoming of a Christian. So things like this were abolished by the royalty, the queen at that time in the 1820s.
Oh.
This was actually, though, kind of a sad event because, and actually it went underground. They kept the hula going in private among some of the citizens. But the reason this is significant is because things like the hula were how the people told their stories. It was done by both men and women, and it reflected the history and traditions of the Hawaiian culture and its people. And so to have it abolished was part of an overall effort by Christian missionaries to bring the Hawaiian people into a modern society and make them more westernized, more like them. And of course, this resulted in the added effect of abolishing their language and destroying their culture. And they didn't have a written language. So the things like the hula were how they kept their identity.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So these things were starting to fall away. However, just a few years later, in the 1850s, you have the very first Latter-day Saint missionaries going over to Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
And they struggled at first because they actually were focusing on the haoles, as the Hawaiians call them, the white people, because they didn't know the language. And so they could only speak with the English-speaking white people on the islands, which were mainly businessmen, farmers. They were farming sugarcane.
Right.
They basically controlled, because of their wealth and influence, they controlled the politics of the island too. And this eventually came to a head when the businessmen on the island were taking hits from U.S. Sanctions, trying to protect domestic farmers and the Hawaiian government. And so after a series of events at the end of the 19th century, Hawaii was annexed, and the ruler were kicked out of their kingdom and basically placed on house arrest.
Oh no.
Yeah, really sad history. And actually, at this time, it should be noted that the queen, who had just been removed from her throne, she was a Latter-day Saint.
Oh.
She got baptized.
Interesting.
In fact,
okay.
Yeah, the locals, the native people of Hawaii, they had this long, storied, and difficult history with the Christian businessmen and missionaries who had taken control of their island for a couple generations, at least since the 1830s to the end of the century. And the queen, forgive me, I'm forgetting her name right now. It's a beautiful name, though. But she was distrustful of all of the different religious groups. And when the Mormons were starting to become prominent out there, she had one of her men go undercover as a spy and spied on the Latter-day Saints. He then joined the church because he was so impressed by them.
Wow.
Right. And then he reported this back to the queen. The queen also fell in love with them. She began letting the Latter-day Saints have meetings in the palace. So they were having sacrament meeting and church meetings in the palace. And she got baptized. She was dethroned. U.S. government annexed Hawaii. They started building ports like Pearl Harbor. But the real important issue here, so I've given the backstory about Hawaii. That's sort of the wrap up of it.
Okay.
But the other significant part here is that the 1850s Latter-day Saint missionaries there, within 4 years, translated the Book of Mormon into their language. So remarkably fast, and a very comprehensive and accurate translation. And this happened through a series of miracles. But the point is, they now had their language preserved. And literally, this is what saved the Hawaiian language.
Oh.
And it also contributed to the preservation of the Hawaiian culture for the next 50 or so years, really more like 50, 60, 70, about 70 years, when places like BYU, Hawaii, came into prominence on the island, and began doing extra work to help preserve the culture, the language, and its traditions.
Wow, that's really
cool. As well as the Polynesian Cultural Center, which was established by Latter-day Saints.
Well, that's really cool because, the theme, one of the themes in the Book of Mormon is having this record so that the language wouldn't be corrupted of the people.
Yeah.
Right? So that's really fascinating.
Now, of course, again, with these histories, they have unforeseen consequences that play out throughout the history, and these consequences happen to be wonderful. There was a Latter-day Saint colony that was established on one of the outer small islands, Oahu, called Laie. And Laie is still a Latter-day Saint complex today that you can go visit. It's right next to the Polynesian Cultural Center and the LDS Temple. That's in Oahu, and it's a beautiful temple. They have a wonderful visitor center too. I got to I work in the Air National Guard, and I got to do a training out there briefly, and had a little bit of free time where I was able to go up to the temple grounds. And that was my first time in Hawaii, and that was just a couple years ago. I loved it. It was a beautiful experience and a wonderful memory to have. But just being in that area of Laie, you can feel the spirit so strongly, so powerfully. And the spirit of the people there has been a wonderful, uplifting spirit that has been cultivated for generations now, since the late 19th century. And with it, they have preserved vigorously their cultures and tradition. And among that is the tradition of music. And they have such wonderful music. And there's this wonderful article written by the Smithsonian. So again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just read the Smithsonian article, and I'll read a bunch of excerpts from that for you now, so you get an understanding. This is what they cover. So this is by historian John Troutman of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and he states that. Oh, you know what? I need to give you just one more little detail here.
Okay.
So out of Laie, there came a young man named Joseph Kekuku, named after Joseph Smith, naturally, but also President Joseph F. Smith, who also has a famous history on the Hawaiian Islands and loved the Hawaiian people, and they loved him.
Oh.
So you have Joseph Kekuku, who grew up in Laie, and he loved music. And so this is where the article picks up. We have, again, historian John Troutman. He says that Kekuku's ingenuity resulted in the total kind of sonic transformation of music that would become known as country, blues, and rock and roll. So again, I'm not stating this. The Smithsonian is stating this, right? That it was a Mormon who contributed to the development of these music styles and genres.
Fascinating.
So the Smithsonian writer, another one, Halima Shah, goes on to explain the instrument that Kekuku developed is played on the lap, and the guitarist plucks the chords instead of strums them while running a steel bar over the neck. Over time, the technique was refined and the guitar modified. Kekuku raised the strings further off the fretboard and used a smooth cylinder to run over the strings as he played. This was known as the steel guitar.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
A distinctive country sound.
Very distinctive sound, right? Yeah. Same with blues as well. The style comes from Hawaiian traditions, and so we'll get into that. This was a time of turmoil. So I guess I have a little bit of note here about just the annexation of Hawaii. So I guess we don't need to cover that. I covered it already pretty well. It is notable, though, that many Hawaiian people at this time of annexation and the conflict between the Western businessmen, many of them sons of Protestant missionaries who ended up settling on the island, they ended up developing colonies both in Oahu, but also in Utah. So there was a Utah colony of Hawaiian natives for some time. They eventually went back to Hawaii, but the reason they left is because of the turmoil in Hawaii at the turn of the century. And many were distrustful of Americans because they heard stories about how Americans treated Native Americans, the Indian tribes. And they knew how they were being treated on their own island. So they actually didn't want any association. So many tried and did their best, what they could, in Hawaii or sailed to other nations. But a few saw that it was beneficial to be among Latter-day Saints. And they found that the Latter-day Saints were more trustworthy than other Americans.
Gotcha.
So they had a colony with them for some time. That's kind of an interesting history. And actually it was Kekuku's parents did leave the island, and they went to that colony in Hawaii for some time, and he went off to boarding school at that time. And that's where he discovered his steel guitar style.
Awesome.
So let's see. So Kekuku, he soon found himself touring the west coast of the United States and interacting with other musicians. So, for example, in Seattle, Washington, a newspaper called Kekuku the world's greatest guitar soloist.
Oh.
Yeah. Already generating notoriety. He continued his tour in the American South. And of course, segregation was widespread, and Kekuku was kept out of most establishments. However, this led to him playing among many Southern musicians of the day. And his new sound became the topic of conversation by patrons and musicians wherever he was heard. His lessons were highly sought after, and many of these students were already popular artists. and some of them up and coming bands.
Hmm.
So historian Shaw, she goes on and says reports of the steel guitar, its soft lilting sound became inseparable with music in the American South. Kekuku had created a musical technology that was refined, replicable, and popularized.
Hmm.
Troutman states it was music that had never been conceived before. So think of it, this brand new sound and instrumentation, probably one of the greatest innovations in music since the piano or harpsichord. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he actually further explains, after their performances, the musicians would all end up in boarding homes. This included mariachis, Chinese acrobats, and all of these other performers hanging out, playing music, and having a really good time together. They were making the most of their segregated circumstances, and they were learning from each other. Shaw further points out that there are issues with the history of music influence. Music associations were very much a product of the time, and those segregated issues have informed our music history today. He explains Hawaiian performers are the unsung heroes of Southern music, especially country and blues, which is a surprising idea given that Native Hawaiian influence is rarely cited in Southern music history. Again, I have a last quote from Troutman. He says, "I grew up in Alabama, and I think that a lot of people who think about Southern music typically imagine a very black and white world. Country music being the kind of white hillbilly music, and blues being the music of African Americans in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana." Mm-hmm. He continued, "In large part, that's due to the fact that the music industry itself began categorizing music along racial lines in the 1920s. Music executives marketed country music to whites and branded blues as African American race music. The two categories conveniently fit into a segregated society, and so Kekuku, the Hawaiian influence, tends to be left out."
Right, because it's just binary, they're saying. That's really interesting. Do you think that the contributions of the, because you said they all were they were all congregating together. So is it reasonable for us to assume that the influence of the electric guitar was introduced into the blues because of the segregation?
Actually, no.
No.
And that's the part I'm going to get into.
Yeah, because I noticed that you said it was a part of the blues, but it's also part of the country music, which is traditionally white. So
yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we covered blues and country, and now there's also rock and roll.
Right.
So we have the steel guitar invention by Kekuku, and this led to some other innovations, but it took place a few years later by another Latter-day Saint.
Oh, okay.
And this is so fun. Right?
Kind of a new thing.
And this guy was a Latter-day Saint, and that guy's a Latter-day Saint. And by the way, this is also a Latter-day Saint. Yeah, Latter-day Saints pop up in the history in the most surprising of places, and it's an amazing discovery to find. I get so excited. And honestly, when I was writing this book, and again, I took a year off of work, and I spent all of my time, 8 to 10 hours a day, researching this stuff. And it blew my mind every step of the way because of how interwoven members of the church are with our history that literally shaped the foundations of American culture today.
Yeah. Well, and what better place for a Latter-day Saint to, I mean, we're such countercultural people as it is. So it makes total sense that we would be involved in music in the counterculture in the rock and roll music.
Yeah, but that said, I mean, even so, Latter-day Saints and the arts. I mean, I have a whole chapter dedicated to just Latter-day Saints and the arts.
Awesome.
It's an amazing read, and it's so fun to see because and they're there because they have this history that again is so. Funny enough, it's so unknown. It feels like it should be known, but it just isn't. But there's this history of tradition within the arts that was sparked from the very beginning. The Latter-day Saints danced, they made music, they did plays, They were into all of the arts, and of course, in no small part was their talents cultivated as such because of their desire to edify all the things around them. And this is most particularly seen in temple artistry.
Yeah.
You have art. How many artists does it take to make a temple beautiful?
Oh, probably hundreds.
You've got all kinds of talents represented there, right? You've got
Yeah.
woodwork, stonemasons, painters, architects, and all of them are artists, and they are magnificent at that. I mean, you look at the Salt Lake Temple just as an example, but there are plenty of others.
Yeah.
And the temple is a perfect representation of this culture and tradition that has been cultivated by Latter-day Saints since their inception.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a unique style too. It's not like I don't know. It's like unlike anything out there. The Salt Lake Temple is what I'm referring to specifically, but the architecture style of it is just so different. I mean, the outside of it is clearly kind of Gothic, right? But the interior is, I mean, it's just very, very unique. Let's say countercultural. Let's say.
And any members out there or any listeners out there who aren't familiar with the inside of temples, you can look them up online. There's lots of pictures for it. I highly recommend it. They're beautiful. You can see the artistry that's put into them.
Mm-hmm.
And we invite people to do that all the time. In fact, I often when I have coworkers ask me, "Hey, what are you doing this weekend?" Might be a weekend I happen to be going to the temple with my wife, and I'll say, "Yeah, I'm going to go to the temple. We're going to do some worship up there. Have you ever seen a temple before? Let me show you a picture." I get out my phone. I pull pictures. I'll take a look at it. You want to see some of the rooms? This is amazing. Let me see. You got to see this. And I'll show them some rooms, and they're like, "I never would have thought." But it's one way to introduce the subject.
Yeah.
Right? Why do we believe what we believe? There are so many ways to answer that question, but how do you answer that question in a way that makes other people interested?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the artistry, for one. I'm sure plenty of people listening to this right now know many artists who would probably be baffled at the type of artistry contribution made by Latter-day Saints. I mean, I'm not even scratching the surface here. Again, I have a whole chapter on the subject, and that barely scratches the surface.
Yeah. And you're just talking about just rock and roll, which is such a, well, country, and then the blues, and then rock and roll, which is so massive, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. How did that come about? How did rock and roll and the electric guitar happen?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it began in 1927 by wiring a banjo to a radio speaker and producing the world's first electric guitar.
Mm.
This innovation would push sound and entertainment in the 21st century naturally. That's obvious to see. I mean, how essential is an electric guitar in so much of our music today?
Yeah.
Or at least has been since the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, it's such a unique instrument. I was thinking about that the other day, but it's such a unique sound, and you really can't get it from anything else. I mean,
truly. Yeah. And this led, of course, to the electrifying of all kinds of instruments.
Mm-hmm.
But it was first created by a man named Alvin McBurney.
Okay.
And yes, he was a Latter-day Saint.
Awesome.
The discovery popularized the technique of amplifying the guitar and later other string instruments. But McBurney took the stage name of Alvino Rey, and some music historians will definitely know this name because he was absolutely huge. He took on the name Alvino as a way to fit more in with the Latin craze that was beginning to sweep the nation in the 1930s. Now, Ray possessed a talent for both music and mechanics, which might be obvious since he's playing around with radios and hooking them up to instruments. He was born in California. He's known as the father of the pedal steel guitar, as well as the electric guitar. This design of the pedal steel guitar, the innovation mounted the steel guitar that was invented by Kekuku on a stand, as you would mount probably like a keyboard, so it's laying sideways. 6 pedals were then connected underneath And I think you have a picture of this somewhere. If not, highly recommend pulling one up.
Okay.
And these pedals, they bent and altered the pitch of each string, similar to the design of a harp, but turned on its side.
Huh.
To give you kind of an illustration there. This allowed the greater control of the instrument and for a greater range of sound manipulation. Very innovative. Ray enjoyed technical experimentation from a young age. He built his first radio at the age of 8.
Wow.
And soon became one of the youngest licensed ham radio operators in the United States. At age 10, he got his first banjo and started learning the guitar by age 12. But at 15, he had already combined his talents and created the first amplified electric instruments, cementing his legacy in this new age of music that was coming about. Now, even so, he didn't actually acquire a patent for this until much later and under new designs. So there was actually several iterations of this that developed in that time period. But he remained a pioneer in many ways and across the music industry. He actually charted music hits by the dozen through the 1930s and the 40s, and 7 of which made it to the top 10 list. So this gets more interesting because Alvino later joined forces with the also newly popular King Sisters band. And he married one of the sisters. I think it was Louise.
Oh.
And the King family, guess what? They were also Latter-day Saints.
Of course.
And they were becoming very popular. They had a great group, and you can still, it's easy to go online and listen to some of their old music. They're very good. And together with Ray, they formed what became known as America's first family of song.
Huh.
Yep. And Ray and the King family, they continued producing hits through the 1960s. And as you might imagine, this family of musicians going about the country, making all these hits, they inspired other family performers, including the Osmonds, who of course are Latter-day Saints,
yes,
as well as the Jackson 5.
Yes, definitely.
So of course, this really influenced the world. So it's not only that that he invented the electric guitar and brought electric instruments into the fold, but he continued to produce music and influence other bands all through their time and into the 1960s, where it took off in a variety of other ways.
Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, just like the idea of a family unit being kind of a band. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's an amazing history to look more into. I highly recommend it. It really transforms society in so many ways. Of course, when we look at the history of music in our culture, there's plenty of things to point to that were change makers in culture. You had the musician revolutionists of the 1970s who largely made music in opposition to the political unrest. Things like the Vietnam War and how that was affecting society. And you also have the development of the maybe the unhealthy side of it, which tends to come out more in the study of some of these histories, where other band members would become or deal with addictions or mental illness, be broken down by their fame, and the tragedies that resulted from it all. But along with that all, you have this amazing history of music that has developed out of these little contributions that took on a life of their own, and that couldn't have happened without these small starts by a few quiet individuals known as Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, well, nobody, very few people would know these people's names, right? That's
right.
It's very interesting how a common thread throughout all of these is that you wouldn't know who they are generally.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's a shame. I think it's a shame.
Yeah.
Again, most of citizens in our country, the majority, over 60%, they don't have an opinion about Latter-day Saints. And they tend to think that Latter-day Saints don't contribute anything to society because they have no reason to think that they do. They don't know this history. And why don't they know the history? Well, it's hard for others to know the history if the saints themselves don't know this history.
Yeah. Well, without that instrument too, without the the sound of the electric guitar, it would be very difficult to express in music certain emotions.
Right.
And
Like Hendrix, for example. Oh my gosh.
yeah, I don't know. There just seems to be, to me, something as you were talking, just like this, something connected with the countercultural aspect of it. And it does make sense to me that Latter-day Saints, since we're so unique in the way that we view the world, view Christianity, we are very much countercultural in our founding. It makes a lot of sense that we would be involved in a countercultural movement of music. And even inventing the instruments to be able to express that. That seems really fascinating to me. There seems to be something to that.
Yeah. And isn't it, just to tie it back to the beginning, isn't it interesting that it all started with the preservation of a minority persecuted culture on a little island?
Yes, and their language and their music.
Yeah.
That's very fascinating. And of course, because of the Book of Mormon, you know, and the theme in the Book of Mormon saying that we need these records, you know, because our language is going to be corrupted if we don't have them.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating.
It's also interesting to point out, like you mentioned, the counterculture aspect to it. What was the culture of the 19th century in regard to native tribes? It was destructive. Destructive,
and they didn't have a very good opinion of them. Let's say.
Yeah. And what was inspiring this kind of behavior? Again, we have to look. It's worth having a conversation about the compare and contrast between ideologies, between belief systems, and our Christian brothers and sisters. They're known for so much good, and they're also a part of this history that is profoundly destructive.
Yeah.
And there is, and I don't mean to diminish it. There is lots of good there.
Of course, yeah.
And we want to support those arguments for it.
Yes.
It's also just worth noting that when presented with something bigger, something more like the restoration, okay, is what I'm getting at. When presented with something that's more than what they have, the history shows that it's more of a stumbling block, a hindrance to progress, rather than an aid to it. And I think that is something worth pointing out, something worth being aware of.
Yeah. Well, and something that I just thought of too, like a lot of the music of the blues and rock and roll does involve African Americans and African American history as well. And it's very interesting to me that Latter-day Saints invented this instrument that is allowing them to express their frustrations. And of course, it goes back to the history of Latter-day Saints being abolitionists as well, you know, wanting to end slavery, you know, before it was popular. We were very hipster in that regard. But it's so fascinating. And we invented this instrument for them to give them a voice, kind of. It seems to me. Not only did the Book of Mormon give the Hawaiian people their language back as an instrument, but we're giving them an instrument. It's very symbolic. It seems like.
I like that. I think you're getting into some an understanding I hadn't considered before, and it's great. Yeah, I love that.
How fascinating. Yeah. Are there any remarks that you'd like to end with?
Oh yeah. No, I think that was plenty. I think we covered a lot of ground there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for watching this episode. If you haven't already, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And stay around. We're going to have one more episode in this series, and we might have Ryan come back again and tell more stories later. But that would be great.
600 pages. I spent a year studying this, and it's basically all I know.
Well, you have a lot of stories, probably 600 pages worth.
Talk about it. I would love to.
All right. Thank you so much. And until next time, bye.